Szeretettel köszöntök mindenkit, ez itt a Könyvhét a karanténban esemény, ahol Napolitanoval fogok beszélgetni, aki egy csodálatos író, tőle a Dear Edward, magyarul pedig az Ezüst, madarak, meg is mutatom, könyv, amit Magyarországon kiadnak tőle. Köszöntsék velem szeretettel Napolitanót.
Hello.
Hi, It's a wonderful feeling to get to talk to you after reading your book. It's always amazing to meet a person whose story and whose ideas and whose thoughts and a little bit of maybe her belief system. I get to know a little bit from the pages, and now I get to meet you in person and ask you questions. So it's an honor for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for chatting with me. I appreciate it.
So 2020 started with a huge bang for you. I assume you had to start promoting this book, and I'm sure you had a lot of dates and locations where you were supposed to go to, and maybe you did at the beginning of the year, and then suddenly everything came to a halt. How did that color the entire process for you?
I mostly feel very grateful that it came out in the beginning of January in the US, and it came out in February in the UK and in the Netherlands, at least. So I did go on tour, so I did get to launch the book in a way, at least in the States. I went on our national morning television show called The Today Show, as like their book club pick. And I went to California and Ohio and DC. So I really did go on the first leg of my tour. And then I went to London and the Netherlands in February. And so I basically completed the first, leg of the tour. And then I was supposed to go on a second leg, and that leg was canceled. But I think it made a real difference to have the book come out sort of into a normal world. So people were reading about it and seeing me in their local bookstore or whatever before everything shut down. I feel a lot of sympathy for writers that have books coming out, particularly debut writers who have books coming out like during the pandemic. So I can't feel really anything other than grateful that the timing worked out, and I was lucky.
I think it's an amazing energy that a writer receives from the audience when he or she gets to meet them, and now that energy has been transferred to the online world, mm-hmm. and that's quite a different type of connection. How do you feel about that?
I think it's really interesting because the last time I had a book come out was in 2011. So the online world was very different. Like Instagram didn't exist, which means that Bookstagram, the hashtag, did not exist. And so I've kind of been amazed by how vibrant the online book world is. And thank goodness, because we don't have the real world right now. So the online book world is where everyone goes to read and talk about and share their, the books that they love that they're reading. So I do feel a lot of love and affection and get like wonderful notes online from people every day, basically. So it's not the same as being in person, certainly, but I think it's a really nice avenue for shy people who maybe don't live near a major city to be able to communicate with each other and with the authors. So I think it's all good. I get very nervous being in person, like doing events makes me very nervous. I'm very shy and introverted, and I can do it. Like I can totally do an event, and I won't seem shy to you, but it takes a lot out of me. So in many ways, this online world is actually better suited to my personality than going and doing big events.
And before we dive into the book and the story, I really am interested in how you're doing with your family. I mean, it's a new situation for a lot of people to spend so much time under the same roof for such an extended period of time. So how does that feel for you as a family?
I have two sons. I have a 10-year-old who's almost 11 and a son who just turned 13. They both have birthdays during the pandemic window. And I mean, overall, it's good. We get along very well, but we live in Brooklyn in a really small apartment and we don't have any outdoor space. So that's the part that's hard. Like my 10-year-old doesn't get run around as much as he should because the virus has been so rampant here that you really do try to limit your outdoor time. And you can't, we have a big park near us, which is wonderful, but you have to go first thing in the morning or there's too many people there. So it's things like that that have been challenging, but we're really lucky. I mean, I'm lucky. I'm a novelist. You know, I'm not having to stay home from my office and, you know, losing income. And my husband is a teacher, and he teaches online. So we've been very fortunate. We're just a little like space and outdoor deprived.
Of course, I try to watch every available video and read every article that has ever been written about you. Or months ago, I think you were in London. You recommended a book, Station 11, to readers about the Georgian flu wiping out much of the population, which now has a completely different ring to it, doesn't it?
Yes, I know. I mean, if we had been, when I went to London, it was like the beginning where people were like, what's going to happen? Like it was coming, but we didn't know what it meant yet. I don't know that I would have chosen that as one of the 3 books that I featured that week otherwise. Although I think apparently the sales for that book has completely spiked during the pandemic. People are watching, there's some movie called Contagion. I think that's what it's called. Yeah. And people are like streaming that movie and reading Station 11. It's like, I guess if you dive down into a hole, you might as well like fully dive down. I would never read Station 11 now, but it is one of my favorite books. I absolutely adore it.
Okay, now onto your book. It's called Ezüst madarak, which translates to silver birds, which, without me giving a spoiler, I'm unable to share with the readers why it's called that. But I think it's a very interesting translation as compared to Dear Edward. What are your thoughts on this translation? And do you regularly consult with translators, since your book has currently, if I'm not mistaken, maybe you have a more updated version, but you have 23 publishers internationally, maybe more. So do you keep in touch with the afterlife of your book in this regard?
I mean, I'm fascinated by, excuse me, by the translations and the sort of different interpretations of the titles is one of my favorite things, actually. I mean, I love the cover that you just held up, and I think that's a lovely title. The publishers do reach out to me to get permission, I guess, to change the title. So I don't have, say over the translation at large, but they want me to approve if they're changing the title of the book. And I've approved them all. I mean, I understand that they know their readers in the context of their language, much better than I could. And I really am enjoying, collecting the different titles. The Italian version is the translation of 2 lines that are near the end of the book. And it's "Don't waste time, don't waste love" is the Italian title, obviously in Italian. And that is like delightful to me. Silver Birds is delightful to me. It's just really interesting.
I understand that it took you 8 years to write the book, and you did say it several times that it was incredibly hard to say goodbye and let go. But if I'm not mistaken, this time you don't quite let go of this story, or at least some of its characters.
Oh, you mean in the next book, the new book that I'm working on? Well, I actually changed it. So I am letting go of Edward and everyone in that world. I think it was so hard for me to let go that I sort of tried to make it make sense to move part of that world into the new fictional world, but I realized that wasn't the right path. So it is a fully new novel that I'm working on now. So I have left them behind, sadly. Although, I mean, I really like talking about Dear Edward because I miss them so much. So I do miss that world.
Well, then it's time to say a few words about what the story is. If you could give us a short synopsis of what Silver Birds or Dear Edward is about.
Sure. Well, I should say it's inspired by a real plane crash. There was a real plane crash in 2010, a flight from South Africa bound for London, and it crashed in Libya. And there was only one survivor, a 9-year-old Dutch boy. And they found him about a half-mile away from the rest of the wreckage, and he was still buckled into his airplane seat. And he had a punctured lung and a broken leg, but he was otherwise fine. And his parents and everyone else on board had died immediately. And I became obsessed with that news story. And I needed to know, I couldn't figure out how that little boy could be okay, like how he would be able to make a new life after losing everything like that and being through such an incredibly catastrophic trauma. And so I started writing the novel because I wanted to figure out if it was possible for him to be okay. So I put together sort of a set of fictional circumstances to see if it could be done. And so I started, my flight is from Newark Airport in New Jersey, and it's bound for Los Angeles. And I'm not giving anything away by saying that it crashes, but in the first chapter of the book, Edward and his brother and his parents are boarding the flight in Newark Airport, and you get to know some other passengers on the plane too. And then at the end of the first chapter, the flight takes off. And then the second chapter is later the same day after the plane has crashed. And Edward is the only survivor, and he's in the hospital. And from then on, the two storylines alternate. So we trace the arc of the flight, and we follow these people on the flight for the course of the book and the course of the flight. And then every other chapter is Edward and how he moves on after the plane has crashed. And that's basically how the book works.
So it's a parallel storyline, the air versus the ground. Mm-hmm. If I have to make a differentiation between the two, that's an interesting way to separate the two storylines. One up, one down.
Yeah, that's true. It is true. I think I knew when I started that I wanted them side by side because I felt that if someone went through something as catastrophically terrible as what this little boy went through, it wouldn't be a trauma that he would be able to set down. He would have to carry it for the rest of his life, and it would be a matter of learning how to carry it and becoming comfortable with inhabiting that space and that full sense of self that involved that day and everything after. So I knew that I wanted them to both exist with the same amount of weight and also right next to each other, because that's how I think it was for Edward.
And what do you think made you obsessed with this story, with this true, terrible tragedy that wanted you to dissect it to such an extent and think it over?
I think there were a few things. One thing was that in 2010, social media had sort of reached a level where it was recognizable as what we know it as today for the first time. So for the first time, everyone that you knew was on Facebook, including your mother. Like in 2010, that was the first time that had happened. So when this massive international event happened, because this plane crash was huge news, it was 24/7, all news media across the world. Most people have forgotten it because so many terrible things happen all the time, and it was 10 years ago. But it was a huge event. So not only, for the first time, I wasn't just getting the story from the journalists and the newscasters, sort of the gatekeepers for our news, but there were young girls that were creating Facebook pages devoted to the little Dutch boy saying how cute he was and how sad they were for him. And there were airplane aficionados that were speculating about why the plane might have crashed. And there were news leaks online about, like from the hospital where the little Dutch boy was being treated, saying that the president of Libya had phoned him in his hospital room to tell him that he hoped he would be okay, which seemed crazy to me. And so that was really interesting. You heard all these different voices, non-authorities, that were weighing in for the first time. And it gave me like a 360-degree view of this kind of event, which was fascinating to me. And then the other thing was that there was a photo that accompanied nearly every news story about the crash of the little boy in his hospital bed. I found out since then that it was an unauthorized photo, and I don't know how it got distributed so widely, but it was with every news story. And it was a photo of him in his hospital bed with his eyes closed. And he's so beautiful. He's just a beautiful little boy, and so small and so broken looking. And I have two sons, and at the time they were 1 and 3, so they were really little. And I would just look at this picture and think, like, how is this little boy going to be able to get out of his hospital bed? And how is he going to be able to walk out of that hospital without his mom and his dad and his brother? Like, how can he go on and have a Tuesday and smile and like go swimming? Like, I couldn't figure out like how he could be okay. And so I think that I had this desire to try and save him, even though I didn't know him and he was halfway across the world, and also figure out, I wanted to save my sons too, like before they needed to be saved, to figure out if I wasn't there and something terrible happened to them, like, could they be okay? So it was all of this stuff knit together that created this sort of obsession for me. And I knew almost right away that it was something I was going to have to write about, even though I had no aviation knowledge or prior interest, or, I had never been tracking plane crashes. All of this fell outside of my normal interest, but that's part also that made me realize that this was a story that I needed to write, to figure out even why I needed to write it.
Were you interested, or did you manage to track him down and contact him and find out how he was? The actual boy?
Yeah, no, I didn't want to. The thing was, his aunt and uncle came from Holland and adopted him and brought him back home. And they did an amazing job from like the time they got him from the hospital of protecting his privacy. They even they blacked out the windows of their car so that the press couldn't take photos of him. They never gave another interview. They completely shielded him, which is 100% the right thing to do. They did a beautiful job. And that was part of why I couldn't know if he was going to be okay, because I couldn't know anything about him. And I never wanted to bother them, because it wasn't nonfiction that I wanted to write. I wanted to explore that experience, but the last thing I would want to do is to sort of, put anything else on this family that had suffered so much. So also, I wanted to write a fictional story. I didn't want anything to really be about a real person at all. It was just his situation that inspired me to move forward.
I was just wondering if he was aware that there was a book written that was based or that was sparked because of his story.
I think his family in Holland knows about it. I know that, but I don't think they knew about it until it was about to come out. And I don't know anything more than that. I mean, the fact that it came out in that country, which is quite small, and also many of the people who, that flight from South Africa bound for London was largely Dutch passengers. So many Dutch people died, I think around 70 on that flight. So it's a famous flight and a famous crash in the Netherlands. So, for those reasons, I think is unavoidable for them to know about it. But for me, the last thing I want to do is to cause them a second more of, unhappiness or reflection on something that maybe they don't want to reflect on anymore. So it's important for me to be clear that it's entirely fiction, and that I wish only, the best things for him and his family.
Well, getting back to the fictionalized version, the storyline relating to the fact that he not only lost his parents, which is horrible in itself, but also lost his brother, who was only a few years older than he was, and they were extremely close to one another. That was an especially harrowing aspect of the crash. So for you, how important was it to explore that sibling relationship?
It became really important. I think that if I hadn't had children when I started writing the book, I think my understanding would have been that, of course, the worst loss for him is the loss of his parents. That would be the traumatic foundational loss. But because I had two kids when I started, and my boys were 1 and 3, and you don't really know anything about your kids when they're that age. Like, they're adorable and ridiculous, and like they're walking around with like buckets on their head, and they cry over the strangest things. You're basically like hugging them, trying to keep them alive and laughing at them when they're toddlers. And so you don't know like who they're going to become or like what their strengths are, any of that stuff. So the only thing that I really knew about my boys when I started writing was that they were deeply in love with each other. And my husband and I had been surprised by this. I don't know that we should have been. It just wasn't something that I was looking forward to in parenthood or even thought to expect. I was like, you have a child and then you have another child. And yes, they're siblings. But from when my younger son came home from the hospital with me, it was like, for my older son, it was like he was being reunited with him as opposed to being introduced to him. And they just doted on each other, and they still do. They're so wound up and interwoven with each other. It's really beautiful. So I didn't write my boys into the book, but their love ended up in the book. And I realized, you're not supposed to lose your sibling. Like, eventually you grow up and you leave your parents. We expect to have to go through our parents' deaths at some point in our lives. You don't expect, and you're not, programmed to be able to lose your peer, your sibling. And so it became very moving to me to write their relationship and to write Edward's grief for his brother after the crash, and how sort of that was the one piece that he really will never recover from, was very sweet and sad to me.
You did say before that it's so important to put invisible markers of your own life in novels. Mm-hmm. Is that what you were referring to now?
Yeah, that's one of them, certainly. When I think of it, I think of the invisible markers. It's more like a fun thing you can do when you write. Like, for instance, Linda, who's one of the passengers on the plane, who takes a pregnancy test while she's on board. She's from in the book, she's from South Bend, Indiana. And one of my best friends lives in South Bend, Indiana. So like, it's like, that's like a tiny little like hello to my best friend. And the mother, Jane, on the flight has a comet-shaped birthmark on her collarbone that she presses during the flight to sort of like connect herself with her deeper self. And that's a reference to a novel that I love, Cloud Atlas by the Irish writer David Mitchell. So it's more little things like that I write into the book where no one else would see it, but it adds a layer of like affection and meaning. It multi-layers it, in a way that makes it richer for me, even if, other people can't see it. And it's also just like dorky fun.
You are one of the lucky ones because you knew at a very early age what you wanted to be, and you pursued it in spite of all the difficulties, rejections, and lack of getting published. And now you're here, and you have this wonderful success. So that's a really truly amazing story in itself. Would you go back for me to the age of 10 and describe how that moment was when you realized that this is what you wanted to do, or this is what made you happy?
Sure. So at that age, and for most of your young education, sort of elementary school, we call it here, a very common exercise still, and I assume around the world, is that your teacher gives you a list of vocabulary words. And you have to write a sentence for each of the words so that they know that you're learning what they actually mean and then how to use them. And I had been doing that for years, and for whatever reason, on that day, the teacher said, I want you to put them into sentences that connect to each other, so it makes sense as like a little story in a paragraph. And so I went home to do the assignment, and I did it. And then I looked up at the clock, and I really thought that 5 minutes had passed and 45 minutes had passed. And at the age of 10, 45 minutes might as well be like 7 hours. So like, it's such a long time. And the only other time that I had experienced sort of time disappearing like that was when I was playing, like with my friends, like make-believe outside or playing soccer or whatever, never doing homework or anything academic. And I just remember staring at the clock and just being like in disbelief that time had just disappeared like that. And I just thought, well, this is magic. Like, if there's work that can feel like this is the magic stuff. And I want to be a writer. Like, this is what I want to do. And I was a very serious, shy child. And I started writing a novel like the next day about like a war-torn nurse, like wartime nurse. And I think I wrote like 11 pages and then gave up. But I intermittently, then the next one was about a wartime orphan. I think I wanted to write serious novels, and I felt like if they needed to take place during war, even though I had no personal experience or knowledge of war.
Well, the orphan aspect returns. So
yeah, yeah. Well, that's true. That's true. Yeah, you're right. You got to make it a serious novel, and that's what it takes. That's true. I held on to that. Yeah, but I mean, my commitment to it, to being a writer, you know, it ebbed and flowed with my self-esteem and like whether I thought it was possible, and I hid that for a long time, and nobody else knew, and you know, like I don't ever want like young people to feel like I knew what I wanted to do and I just kept going no matter what. Like, you get knocked down by rejections, by, you know, lack of publication, by a teacher telling you your writing's not that good. There's so many defeats that happen along the way, and they do knock you down. It's just that I always got up and returned to it. And essentially I did that because I get depressed if I don't write. Like, it's part of who I am. Like, I'm not a fully functioning, like, I'm not a good wife, I'm not a good mother, I'm not a good friend if I'm not writing. It's like, it's an engine that I have to keep going inside of myself in order to be my full self. So in many ways, it wasn't like I was incredibly driven in a career. It's not like I was shooting for massive success. I assumed I wouldn't have success. Obviously, I mean, Dear Edward came out when I was 48. So I've been doing this, you know, since I was 10. Success didn't seem to be in the cards. I was doing it for the love of doing it, and so that I could be the best version of myself I could be, and that requires writing to do it.
And also reading. What is your relationship with books, and what reading in general means, especially in this day and age where I think a part of society does read regularly, but a lot of young people do not.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a child, I read voraciously. I mean, I feel very nostalgic for how I read as a kid. because I had no knowledge of like what good books were or bad books. I didn't understand genres. I didn't know really that they existed. So I would read, mysteries, Westerns, thrillers, the Babysitter's Club, like the full remit. And I was never like, there was no guilty reading. It was just, I read everything. And I would go to the library in our town with a duffel bag and fill it up with books every week, and then return them at the end of the week and fill up my duffel bag again. And that was the best. Like, I have this very vast groundwork of books that I read when I was a kid. And then it's much more difficult. It's much more difficult as a grown-up, as a writer, as a parent, to have the time to read the way that I want to read. But I mean, it's still necessary for me. Like, I'm always reading at least one book. So that also, you're right, it's another component along with writing that I require in order to feel whole. If I'm not reading a book, I feel like, like I'm jonesing or something. There's something wrong going on, and I feel like shaky and weird. But it almost never happens. Like, I always know what I'm going to read next before I finish this one. When I'm actually writing, it also can get tricky, because if I'm very deep in like a fictional world, like say if I was 2/3 of the way through writing Dear Edward, when it was just like a fully realized fictional universe in my head and I was very deeply in it, it was very hard for me to read novels during that period, because I think only one deeply realized fictional world can exist in my head at a time. So in the beginning stages of writing something like where I am now, I can read novels because the new world I'm building is more questions than real at this point. So there's room in my head for that. So it gets like, it's just very complicated at this point, but still so wonderful and important and necessary.
Have you also become really flexible in the way you write, in terms of being a mother and a teacher and a wife and so many other things along the way? I guess you had to be flexible in where you wrote, in what time you wrote, how you wrote, how many minutes you could spend doing this. So a lot of things have to become extremely flexible.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect word. I mean, since having children, really, I was fairly regimented about it before I had kids. But since having children, I now will write in any 10-minute window that I have. I'll write in my car. I've written on the subway. If I have a half hour that suddenly appears, I'm writing then. So I'm not as sort of mechanical about it as I once was. And during the periods when my life is really busy, like when I'm teaching a class or, otherwise have like a big commitment on top of everything that I do in my house. During those periods, I make a deal with myself that I have to write for at least 5 minutes a day. And then when I've written for 5 minutes, I put an X on my calendar. And my job is just to see how long a streak of X's I can get. And the purpose there really is that, if I stop working on the project, and I don't think this is just me, I know a lot of other writers that have this experience too, it kind of goes dead. It's like the lifeblood drains out of it if you're not touching it and working on it in a regular way. So if I work on it for 5 minutes a day, it keeps it alive and also keeps it in some small way moving forward, even if I've just written one sentence or I've rewritten a paragraph, so that when I have more time to go back into it, I don't have to spend that time reviving it, which can take like 2 weeks really to like pump the lifeblood back into that universe and like be like, oh, this is real, not just like these wooden characters that are moving through this cardboard universe. So I always recommend that. I mean, different writers write in different ways. Some like to do it in like bursts, and they stay up for 3 days and write 75 pages. So those people aside, I think it's the best practice to sort of do it, allow yourself tiny amounts, but do it regularly. And then you're more likely to dive back in for the 3-hour day or whatever when you have the opportunity. So yes.
You did say once that writing a book is like crossing the ocean. Does that have anything to do with a sense of accomplishment, to set yourself a huge challenge to complete some something, a Herculean task, perhaps?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I don't like to be definitive about these things, but to date, I am not a short story writer. When you get educated in fiction writing, at least in the US, you do it with writing short stories, which makes complete sense because it's a contained unit. It's, a manageable amount of pages, and you're exploring beginning, middle, and end. You can sort of learn the craft of writing the most effectively with a short story. And when I teach, I'm largely, critiquing short stories. And also I work for a literary magazine that's called One Story. It's all short stories that are published in it. So I'm a deep admirer of that craft, but it's not what I do. And there's something about, like, I also recreationally don't usually read short stories. I like to read novels. Like, I like to be like in that ocean. When I get in a lake, I'm like disturbed by how quickly I have to get out of it. Like, I want more. I like to be like completely immersed in it and be like, all right, I'm living with these people for like the next month. And that makes me happy. And I like to feel like this rich unfolding world that it's very hard to do in the size of a short story. So I guess some of it is the accomplishment, but some of it is just like, that's the terrain that I'm the most comfortable in. And that's like the level of character development and world building that sort of delights me. I can't do in a shorter form. The problem with the novel is that there's no immediate gratification. You can finish a short story. It depends, of course, but like in 6 weeks or something like that is possible. And then you have people reading it and telling you you're amazing. If you're writing a novel, like Dear Edward took 8 years, you don't have people telling you you're amazing. It's all a mess for like 8 years. So you have to have the sort of fortitude, I guess, to be okay without, people reading your work for a really long time, and also trusting that it's going to get to a place where you feel like it finally succeeded.
So it's sort of like you don't only want to meet someone, but get to know that person.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to like know who their grandfather is. I want all of it.
Yeah, because your story, Dear Edward, not only centers around him, but a lot of other characters who are on that airplane. So you spent a lot of time researching and getting to know those extra characters that you've come up with, and they could not be more different from one another.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's also that human connection part that comes back again, that seems to be so important to you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I love the opportunity to get to know so many different people and to go into so many different heads. Actually, my favorite thing is to go into someone who's very different from me's head. And since I'm working on it for 8 years, I want to go into as many heads as possible, in order to like make it feel as rich, for the period of time that I'm working on it. So that makes it like more interesting for me. Like just going into Edward for that period of time. I need to plug this now. Sorry, I have to plug in my computer. It's going to die.
That's fine.
So I would, it's not in, like, when I read books that are like one character the entire book, it mystifies me that the writer could, tolerate that sort of limitation for that long. Yeah. So, I mean, it's really about like keeping myself entertained and challenging myself, in these various different ways in the book.
I don't want to keep you up, but I have one last question. It's a little bit bigger question, perhaps, than some of the others, and that refers back again to the Italian translation of Dear Edward. You did say that writing does make you happy, but how would you describe what is at the center of your writing? What is your sole purpose at the end of the day, why you want to write books? What is that that major thought or major feeling that rides through every single story does it have to do with maybe a meaningful life well lived or something along those lines?
Well, I think that's my major theme, but is how to live a meaningful life and how we can sort of maximize our individual lives and sort of max out our potential. Potential sounds like a gimmicky business word, and I don't mean it that way. That makes it sound kind of icky. But like, how can we use all the gifts we've been given to, and all of us have gifts, interpersonal gifts and professional gifts, and just being really good at writing a particular kind of sentence. Like, how can we live our life so that we're using all those gifts and like lighting ourselves up as fully as possible, so that we're, all of this sounds terribly cheesy when you talk about it, but so that you're sort of shining your really specific personal light out into the world as brightly as possible. Which doesn't mean like that you're not depressed sometimes, or that you don't have bad days, or that like you screw up, or decide to stay under the covers and watch Netflix for a weekend or whatever. It doesn't mean being perfect. It means sort of organizing your life so that you are the best version of yourself possible, in part so that you can serve the world in the best way possible. Like, I feel like if I'm not writing, and if I'm not writing novels that I feel like are deeply layered and sort of trying to make sense of what it is to be a human being, then I'm like a shell of myself, and then I'm not serving anyone well, which includes the people in my immediate life, but also at large. I think literature and storytelling, I know literature and storytelling have been with us for as long as we've been humans. And so it's my personal language, and it's my personal, the way that I knit together what's inside me the best and to the fullest potential is through writing. And if I didn't write, then that would be sort of tragic to me. But I don't try, I certainly don't intend in my books and in Dear Edward, I never set out to be like, this is the message that I want to tell, and I want people to, look at their own lives and take that risk, or, quit that job, or, tell that person that you love them. Like, I never think that, and I don't want to be prescriptive in any way with what I write. It's really, for me, just like, I have this story that I become obsessed with, and how can I tell it in the most beautiful, effective way possible? And it's like 12 million problems that I have to solve to get there on every level, from like sentence construction to timelines to everything else. And those are the things that like I'm working my way through. And then what it is at the end, I think holds everything that I am, and holds everything that I'm trying to do. But I'm not conscious of that. And I also wouldn't want to like put that expectation on a reader that they see that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I would call that harmony if I had to pick a word.
Yeah. Yes. I like when you talk about themes for writers, I think in general, it kind of makes you shudder, but also like that's not something that I think about until like the book's done. And I generally don't think about that when I read another, a novel that I think is just like Station 11, for example. Like, I didn't finish it thinking, oh, the themes of human resilience. And, like, I don't think like that. I just think that, God, that moved me to my bones. And I'm so much better for having read it. And I'm so happy that I have that book, like, in my internal, system, and those characters and like moments in that book that will stay with me. Like, what a gift. So obviously there's a lot baked into what made Station 11 give me those things. And I don't necessarily want to break it down, nor do I want to break it down in my own work, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
You did say that, dear Edward, one reason why it touched you or why you wanted to write this story is because of social media. The little boy has become a celebrity, but thanks to social media now, at times of a pandemic, we still manage to have a wonderful conversation without you having to hop on a commercial flight and come to Hungary, or us going to the US or something along those lines. But anyway, let's hope that one day we'll meet in person, and wish you the best of luck with this book and any of your books of the future. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It's been a lovely conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.